Nomination, Department of Education, Linda McMahon of Connecticut to be Secretary.
Senator from Iowa.
The Senate will soon vote to confirm Linda McMahon to be Secretary of Education. I know that some people feel that the Secretary of Education should have extensive experience in a school system. However, it is important to remember that education is still mostly a state and local responsibility. There is no such thing as a federal superintendent of education. The U.S. Department of Education doesn't run any schools. Our many public school systems in this country do not report to Washington, D.C., and Washington also has no authority over what is taught in our schools around the country. The job description of a Secretary of Education is to manage a bureaucracy who runs a number of funding programs. By all accounts, Linda McMahon did a great job running the Small Business Administration in the last Trump administration. I have no reason to believe that she cannot run the Department of Education. I think she understands the difference between state and federal role in education. I also expect that she understands the difference between the executive and legislative branches when it comes to the serious policy making of education. Congress passes the laws and holds the power of the purse. We have also the responsibility to make sure that laws are faithfully executed by the executive branch of government. I expect Linda McMahon to respond to all the congressional inquiries in a timely and responsive manner. On another subject, Mr. President, this day, March 3rd, is World Hearing Day. Approximately 38 million Americans report hearing loss. Meanwhile, an estimated 29 million American adults could benefit from using hearing aids. So I'd like to speak to you about the importance of hearing health and treating hearing loss. Hearing and balance of the body are deeply connected. Even mild hearing loss puts you at greater risk of a fall. Hearing aids can help prevent that risk. Treating hearing loss can lower the risk of dementia. Untreated hearing loss has been linked to loneliness and isolation. It can cut you off from those around you. Historically, hearing aids have been unaffordable and inaccessible. I've heard from Iowans who've told me about their struggles hearing and how they want hearing aids to hear their kids and grandkids, but they held off on buying hearing aids because they were so expensive. Now that brings me to the reason that Senator Warren and I led bipartisan effort to pass and implement legislation called Over-the-Counter Hearing Aid Act. We did that in 2017. That law made over-the-counter hearing aids available in a safe, effective, and accessible option for adults that had no greater than mild to moderate hearing loss. I'm also working to ensure that seniors have access to a range of hearing and balanced health care services in my bipartisan Medicare Audiology Access Improving Act. So, I encourage Americans to take steps to protect and care for their hearing, as well as monitor for signs of potential hearing loss. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the Senate will vote later today to confirm Linda McMahon to be Secretary of Education. Mrs. McMahon is an accomplished businesswoman and public servant. She's known for her role in building World Wrestling Entertainment, better known as WWE, from a small operation to a large and thriving enterprise. And she has used her success to give back and make a positive impact. Mrs. McMahon led efforts to promote reading and civic engagement through WWE. She spent 16 years on the Board of Trustees for Sacred Heart University in her home state of Connecticut. She served on the Connecticut Board of Education. And in his first term, President Trump tapped Linda McMahon to lead the Small Business Administration, where she was known for listening to small businesses to make the SBA a more effective agency. She will bring valuable experience, an incredible work ethic, and a passion for education to her new role leading the Department of Education. And, Mr. President, she has a big task ahead of her. Let's acknowledge that. In January, the nation's report card revealed that American students are still struggling to make up ground lost during the pandemic. Reading scores among 4th and 8th graders declined again after falling in 2022 and 2019. 1/3 of 8th graders are reading below a basic level, the highest proportion ever recorded. Math scores showed modest improvement, but they still remain below pre-pandemic levels. And there's a widening gap in student performance. Mr. President, this should concern all of us. As a son of 2 public school educators and father of 2 daughters who went to public schools, I know this problem isn't going to be fixed by Washington bureaucrats. It's going to be fixed by good teachers, administrators, school boards, and parents, the people who are closest to the students and most invested in their success. Mr. President, the federal government provides less than 10% of funding for schools in this country. The other 90% of funding, money that keeps the lights on, pays teachers, and buys new textbooks, well, that comes from state and local governments and from private sources. But while the federal government provides a small percentage of education funding, it's responsible for an outsized amount of the bureaucracy and mandates in education. And more often than not, it's these policies that are holding back school districts from innovating and ultimately improving the education that they provide. Mr. President, I'm glad that Mrs. McMahon recognizes that education is not one size fits all. States have different needs. School districts and individual schools have different needs. And every student has his or her own needs and aspirations. So I'm glad that Mrs. McMahon plans to work in a way that empowers those closest to the student, because they are in the best position to do what's right for that student. When I met with Mrs. McMahon, we had a long conversation about South Dakota's unique education needs, including our tribal schools. And I look forward to working with Linda McMahon to limit bureaucracy, empower state and local governments, and let good teachers do what they're best at and what they love to do, and that's to help students succeed. Mr. President, most Americans are familiar with Title IX. That was the landmark legislation designed to create equal spaces and opportunities in education for women. Title IX is particularly notable for the effect it's had on women's sports. With its requirement that federal funding recipients create equal athletic opportunities for women and girls, Title IX paved the way for the women's athletic programs we see today at colleges and universities and high schools around the country. But now the gains that have been made through Title IX are under attack. Around the country, we have seen men, biological men who identify as women, take up spaces and medals in athletics meant for actual women. Swimming, track, volleyball, soccer, basketball. This is happening across a range of sports. And, Mr. President, the problems here are obvious. First of all, there is the physical danger that can be posed by men participating in women's sports. But this is about much more than any physical danger. This is a matter of fairness and equality. Title IX, as I said, was created to give women opportunities in spaces that have been denied them, to give women the same opportunities that men enjoy. That's not possible when men are involved in women's sports. Biologically, men possess physical advantages when it comes to sports, things like greater muscle mass and greater aerobic power, which means that, by and large, men are likely to dominate in women's sports, taking wins and medal opportunities away from women. And this isn't hypothetical, Mr. President. This is actually happening. Let me quote from an August 2024 United Nations report on violence against women and girls, which addresses the participation of men in women's sports. And I quote, "Policies implemented by international federations and national governing bodies, along with national legislation in some countries, allow males who identify as women to compete in female sports categories. In other cases, this practice is not explicitly prohibited and is thus tolerated in practice. The replacement of the female sports category with a mixed-sex category has resulted in an increasing number of female athletes losing opportunities, including medals, when competing against males. According to information received by March 30th of 2024, over 800 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports," end quote. Let me just repeat that, Mr. President. According to information received, by 30 March 2024, over 600 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports. Now that, as I said, is from a United Nations report. This isn't some myth that conservatives have dreamed up. This is happening. Mr. President, I could go down a list of examples here in the United States. The female runner who did not qualify for the women's 55-meter final at the state championship because a biological male identifying as a woman qualified in her place. Another female runner who resigned herself to second place at best because, as she said, she knew there would be no winning against the biological male who finished a full minute and 22 seconds ahead of the second place female finisher. The male pole vaulter who won the women's competition with a vault that exceeded that of the second place female finishers by 6 inches. The women's basketball team that saw nearly half of its season's points scored by a male. And that's just a sampling of the stories that are out there. And of course, Mr. President, the female athletes in question aren't just being robbed of their potential places on the winner's podium, they're also being robbed of the opportunities that might be associated with that place. Things like college scholarships. There's one female runner who was robbed of multiple wins by a biological male described the situation, and I quote, "It robs girls of the chance to race in front of college scouts who show up for elite meets and to compete for the scholarships and opportunities that come with college recruitment. I'll never know how my own college recruitment was impacted by losing those 4 state championship titles to a male. When colleges looked at my record, they didn't see the fastest girl in Connecticut. They saw a second or third place runner." Mr. President, this isn't fair. Girls should not be having to compete in races that are stacked against them. Women deserve their own athletic opportunities that are not taken away from them by biological males who have their own spaces in which to compete. They deserve a level playing field. And Mr. President, this is not a niche position. A 2025 New York Times poll found that 79% of Americans, including, I might add, a majority of Democrats, believe that biological males identifying as women should not be allowed to play women's sports. And that's not the only poll that's found that a huge majority of Americans believe that women's sports should be for actual women. Mr. President, at the beginning of February, President Trump took action to protect the original meaning of Title IX and ensure that federal funding would not go to schools that allow men to compete as women. As the father of two former female athletes, I am grateful for his commitment to upholding fairness and common sense. Mr. President, my dad, who was a Division I athlete, came back to my hometown, coached women's sports. Girls basketball, girls track. It would have been incomprehensible to him to think biological boys would be competing against his female athletes. But, Mr. President, unfortunately, there's no guarantee that the next president is going to uphold President Trump's measure. And so today we will consider legislation from my colleague, Senator Tuberville, a former high school girls basketball coach, to permanently reinstate the original intent of Title IX and ensure that women, and women only, participate in women's sports at federally funded educational institutions. Now, Mr. President, I'd love to think that we would easily pass this legislation, that Democrats and Republicans would unite and stand with the vast majority of Americans to protect opportunities for women. But given that every single Democrat voted to block this bill last Congress, I have to say I'm concerned about today's outcome. So this will be a time of choosing for Democrats. They can stand with women, or they can stand with a radical transgender ideology that would see women and their opportunities sacrificed to make way for biological males. Democrats can't have it both ways, Mr. President. It's either one or the other. I had a finance professor in graduate school who used to say that some things are just intuitively obvious. Well, this, Mr. President, is one of those things. And if the Democrats vote to oppose this legislation, they'll have to answer to the women and girls they vote to disenfranchise. I hope Democrats will join Republicans to protect women and women's sports and vote to proceed to the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Democrat leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, tomorrow, President Trump will address a joint meeting of Congress for the first time since taking office, the oath of office. It's my honor, my true honor, to welcome 7 incredible New Yorkers tomorrow who will tell the story of what's under threat by Donald Trump's agenda, from Medicaid beneficiaries to disabled veterans fired from their jobs at the VA, to fired USDA workers, to home health care workers. It will also be my profound honor to welcome Orna Nutra, mother of Omer Nutra, and Ruby Chen, father of Itai Chen, both who were tragically killed by vicious Hamas thugs on October 7th. Orna's son, Omer, was taken hostage by Hamas during the attacks on October 7th. It wasn't until over a year later that Omer's family learned he was murdered by Hamas on October 7th. Ruby's son, Itai, was also taken hostage and tragically murdered by Hamas on the border of Gaza on October 7th. After months of fighting for his return, Itai's family learned that he was also killed by Hamas on October 7th. I spoke to Itai's dad, and I spoke to Orna as well, many times between October 7th and when they were notified that their children had been murdered. It was vicious cruelty of Hamas, whose viciousness seems to be part of their way, not to let the families know what had happened. Over and over again, especially Ruby Chen, who I got to know well and we had Brooklyn roots together, would wonder, is he dead? Is he alive? Is he alive? Is he dead? And Hamas kept them dangling, as I said, viciously and cruelly. What Omer and Itai's family have endured is beyond comprehension. But I'm inspired by their perseverance, by their resolve to keep calling for the safe return of remaining hostages and for the return of the bodies of their loved ones. We must bring all the hostages home now. But it's an honor, true honor, to welcome all of my guests, the Nutras, the Chens, and of course the others, to the Capitol. Now, tomorrow, Americans can expect Donald Trump to say many things that are false, including perhaps Russian information. What we will not hear from Donald Trump, however, is the truth. So today, let us speak the truth about Donald Trump's agenda. In a little over a month, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Republicans have set in motion the greatest transfer of wealth in favor of billionaires we have seen in modern times. On the one hand, you have Elon Musk calling Social Security the greatest Ponzi scheme of all time. You have Doge firing over 7,000 staffers from the Social Security Administration. You have Donald Trump threatening trade wars with our own allies. And you have Republicans cutting $880 billion from Medicaid to pay for their billionaire tax cuts. Money that funds things like community health centers. Money that funds people who desperately need health care. Money that funds parents, or elderly parents of middle-aged couples in the parents are in nursing homes. All of that is at grave risk. Together, these actions will mean diminished wealth for working and middle Americans and more money in the pockets of the billionaires. Because after all, when the wealthiest man on earth calls Social Security a scam and Doge fires 7,000 Social Security staffers, that's a clear sign Social Security benefits are in danger. Donald Trump just said a few minutes ago that he was going to keep the tariffs against Canada and Mexico. When Donald Trump starts a trade war for Canada and Mexico, it means rising costs for produce, for groceries, for cars, even for ordering takeout and happy hour. It is unbelievable what they're doing with these tariffs. It could mean that restaurant owners in states like mine could be forced to close down as food prices go up. It means that building new homes will be more expensive, and those costs will be passed down to would-be home buyers. The bottom line is very simple. One of the greatest things Americans complained about in the past election was the high costs of so many different kinds of goods and products. And now Donald Trump is making it worse because he just said that he would not continue the pause on Canada and Mexico's tariffs, but will let them go into effect. Please, Mr. Trump, rethink your plans to start a trade war, where the average family will get slapped with an average $2,000 extra in costs. Families will suffer, businesses will suffer. You said you'd bring down costs on day one, Donald Trump. Yet here, 1 month in, you're doing something that would raise costs significantly for the American people. And when Republicans cut Medicaid, it means health care costs will go soaring for tens of millions of kids, seniors, people with disability, rural communities. So why are the Republicans doing all this? Why are they creating all this havoc, this chaos, this cruelty, and this harm to the American people? Simple. To cut taxes for billionaires and have the American people pick up the tab. Make no mistake about it. This is what a transfer of wealth looks like. Away from working Americans and into the bank accounts of the billionaire club. Meanwhile, it's not much better in terms of foreign policy and our own security. Our allies across the world will look at America and see a country in decline under Donald Trump. They will watch in horror an American president continue to curry favors with war criminals like Vladimir Putin, while publicly berating friends, brave, valiant people who've risked their lives and have seen so many of their countrymen die in a valiant fight for freedom, like President Zelensky. He gets berated, Putin gets praised. What is going on? Rest assured that nobody on earth was happier with what happened last Friday in the Oval Office than Vladimir Putin. Our allies will also watch in horror as Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth make America less safe. It's the world less safe. There's no other way you can look at it when they give Putin a free pass to launch cyber attacks against the U.S. while we disarm our own cyber operations against Russia. Can you believe that? Letting Putin attack us, and we're saying we won't attack him in terms of cyber warfare. What is going on? The world's turned inside out and upside down, all to the detriment of the safety and security of America and its people. Tomorrow, as Donald Trump addresses our nation, our Western allies will wonder about the future of NATO. So these are difficult and dangerous times, and Donald Trump is taking America, our democracy, and the world down a dark and deeply troubling path. But finally, and most importantly, the American people will not take Donald Trump's agenda lying down. You can see frustration boil over in town halls in Georgia and Kansas and Oregon and everywhere in between. Republican leaders are telling their members to cancel town hall meetings. They're running away from the people because they know how badly the people have been hurt by what they're doing. Maybe they don't want to do it, but they're forced to, because President Trump wants tax breaks for billionaires. You can see the frustration in the polls, too. A majority of Americans believe that Donald Trump has ignored the #1 issue they care about, inflation, rising costs. You can see the frustration online. Last week, I joined a Zoom. Over 3,000 New Yorkers got on the Zoom, ready to mobilize against Republican attacks on Medicaid. And many of my colleagues had similar meetings with similar strong responses. People are ready. They're energized. You can also see it in the courts. The American people can rest assured that whenever the administration breaks the law, we'll take them to court. It will be one of our best tools to protecting our country and putting a stop to the worst abuses of Donald Trump's agenda. And for the most part, the courts are rejecting much of what Donald Trump has tried to do. The more Donald Trump pushes our democracy to the limit, the more Americans will push back. Organizing is never easy, but it works. It works. That's what we'll continue to do. We shall organize here in the Congress, organize in the public square, organize in court to protect the country we all know and love. Nothing that Donald Trump says tomorrow will change that fact. Now on Social Security. Something terrible is happening that Democrats have long warned about. American Social Security benefits, one of the most sacred things people have, one of the most popular federal programs that has ever been created. Social Security benefits are coming under attack. Last Friday, Elon Musk claimed that Social Security is the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time. And now the Trump administration has announced massive cuts, more than 7,000 workers, to the Social Security Administration. These cuts could affect workers who process checks, answer customer service calls, work in field offices across the country. The cuts could very well delay Social Security benefits. It means longer times on the phone to resolve issues. Everyone knows how frustrating it is, especially seniors who need their checks. They haven't gotten them. They want to get on the phone and find out what happens and now have to wait for hours. It could mean local offices, like in my home state, close down. It could mean more Americans get sicker, go hungry, get their checks far too late. You don't need to scratch your head and wonder what Donald Trump and Doge are doing when they fire Social Security staffers and call Social Security a scam. They're getting ready to go after people's benefits, plain and simple. Let's be clear. If Americans can't get their checks in time because staffers have been fired, that is a cut in benefits. If Americans can't get an issue resolved over the phone because there's nobody to take calls, that is a cut in benefits. If field offices are closed, if troubleshooting is halted, if checks come late in the mail, that too is a cut in benefits. The only scam going on here is the one where the President of the United States would try to fleece Social Security from the American people to help pay for tax cuts for their billionaires club. Democrats will not let it happen. And finally, on Linda McMahon, the nominee for Secretary of Education. I'm very proud that every single Democrat will vote against Ms. McMahon. Ms. McMahon's confirmation would be a slap in the face to students, parents, teachers who care about our public schools. Americans believe in public education. They don't want to see these cuts. They don't want to see the Department of Education abolished. If the Trump administration follows through on cuts to education, schools will lose billions in funding. And what's going to happen, Mr. and Mrs. Average American taxpayer? Your property taxes will go up. The least popular tax probably that there is. The American people do not want to see cuts to education and the consequent rising property taxes. But that is the danger of confirming Ms. McMahon. Before Republicans vote for Ms. McMahon, you should remember, slashing funds for schools, students, parents, and teachers, all for the sake of billionaire tax breaks, is a very bad idea. Senate Democrats know it's a horrible idea. The American people know it's a horrible idea. Today, we'll see where Senate Republicans stand. Yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsop-Brooks.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent, let's start over. I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. The price of everything is going up. Outbreaks of measles and bird flu are killing people. Airplanes are almost crashing or actually crashing and falling out of the sky. Tens of thousands of federal workers, including veterans, are being laid off in Donald Trump's government purge. And so, obviously, it's a Monday, and we've got 2 votes tonight, and so we're going to address one of those critical issues. Oh, no, actually, we're going to do something totally irrelevant to 99.9% of all people across the country. Now, let's just start with the basics, which is that everyone has and deserves human dignity without stipulations or preconditions. Not just the people you like, not just the people you understand, not just the people you agree with. Every human being is God's creature. And everyone, especially in the United States of America, has the right to be left alone. That is what freedom means, right? You've got to be left alone to live your life however you want within the bounds of the law. And so, what Republicans are doing today is inventing a problem to stir up a culture war and divide people against each other. And worse, they're trying to distract people from what they're actually doing, which is at a time when people are finding it harder and harder to afford the basic necessities, at a time when diseases we eradicated almost 20 years ago are making a comeback and killing kids, at a time when people are getting on flights and saying an extra prayer or breathing a little heavier, you have Donald Trump and the Republicans saying, you know what? Let's cut taxes for billionaires. Let's take money from regular people and the things that they rely on, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act. Let's take hundreds of billions of dollars from there and shovel it into the pockets of the richest people to have ever walked this earth, because that's what we need and that is what people voted for. Republicans are focusing on the wrong 1%. Trans people are not the reason people can't afford groceries or health care or housing. The other 1%, the top 1% economically, is responsible for a lot of that. And that's who Republicans are desperate to help. And they're doing it by going after some of the most vulnerable people in our society. I will be joining my Democratic colleagues in voting no on the pending legislation. Madam President, I ask consent that the following remarks appear in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, we are witnessing one of the worst starts to any presidency in generations, and it's not even close. There is the possibility of negative growth in the first quarter of this year, which would have been unheard of, so bad economically that the Secretary of Commerce is trying to concoct another way to calculate GDP. If you wonder how bad the data is, you got the Secretary of Commerce going like, well, this whole GDP thing, we've been measuring it wrong for all of these decades. There is no comparison for the staggering levels of incompetence and lawlessness coursing through this administration. And regular people are paying a steep price. Tomorrow night, the president will try to rewrite his record and recast blame when he addresses Congress. I want to go over some of the worst things that he's done that actually hurt people. Because unless you're a billionaire, life has gotten harder, not easier, over the last couple of months. Number one, he's actively raising the price of everything. He is actively raising the price of everything. after specifically promising that he would bring down prices on day one. He has gone out of his way to raise them. The price of eggs is up 15%. Coffee prices are at record highs, and the price of everything from tomatoes to strawberries to clothes to toys to cars to homes and home building is about to go up starting tomorrow because Trump is picking a needless fight with our largest trading partner with tariffs. Prices will skyrocket, businesses will be hurt, and people will lose their jobs. Number two, not even a week into his second term, Trump illegally froze federal funding for all 50 states. All 50 states. With one Monday night memorandum, the White House locked states out of portals for everything from Medicaid payments to housing assistance. Schools, child care centers, rural hospitals, VA clinics were suddenly left wondering if they would have to close their doors or lay off staff. Almost a month later, the taps are not fully turned back on as a result of the freeze and Trump's other executive orders. Hundreds of billions of dollars continue to be withheld from states and communities where they belong. These are taxpayer dollars. These are dollars that are appropriated by this branch of government, the Article I branch of government. So if you don't like how appropriated funds are going to be spent, there is a mechanism for an executive branch to do something about it. They can propose a new budget, and they can either sign or veto a new appropriations bill. But that's not what they did. They just acted as though they could cross out things that they found objectionable. And it's not even as though they did that in some sort of methodical way. They had a bunch of kids going in there, literally kids, Control F. Oh, gender, kill that. Oh, native, kill that. Oh, climate, kill that. That's how they figured out what they were going to cut. Number three, Trump is illegally firing tens of thousands of government workers, many of whom are veterans. And he's not done yet. These are people who've dedicated their careers to public service, and in the case of veterans, risked their lives to protect our country. And they're just like the rest of us. Bills to pay, kids to feed, parents to care for. And they're being discarded. This is the biggest mass firing of veterans in the United States' history. Number four, no one stands to benefit more from this ransacking of the government than billionaires, which is no surprise considering it's being led by the richest people on the planet. Eliminating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that was created in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis specifically to protect people from fraud and deceptive lending practices, or dramatically shrinking the IRS, which means refunds will be delayed during tax season and tax fraud will skyrocket without proper scrutiny. None of that benefits a regular person. None of that benefits a regular person. But it's great news if you're a billionaire trying to wiggle out of paying taxes or a shady lender who's looking to defraud people. Number five, if all of this wasn't enough, Trump and the Republicans are working to cut taxes for billionaires and make regular people foot the bill. Now, that's not unusual for them. Cutting taxes for billionaires is kind of their thing. They like it. It is their reason for being. But it's alarming nonetheless in the brazenness of how they're going about doing this. They basically want to cut money that goes to regular people and book that as savings, right? So whenever you do a tax bill, if you're doing it right, it pays for itself, which means you have to have something on the side of the ledger where you're bringing in more money, and then another side of the ledger where you're cutting revenue, and then it adds up to zero, it nets out, deficit neutral. The problem is they can't really figure out how to deliver this $4 trillion or so tax cut to the wealthiest corporations that have ever existed in human history and do it in a deficit neutral way. And so they are just like committing arson within departments and then trying to book that as savings to pay for the tax cut. Now, it is true that all political parties have a tendency towards exaggeration. And so you'd be forgiven if you hear this, you go like, well, it's a Democrat saying this is what the tax policy is, and maybe it's not exactly like that. But I want you to understand that what's happening in the U.S. House as they negotiate over this big tax bill is exactly that. They're demanding more and more cuts from the Affordable Care Act, from Social Security Administration in terms of the staffing of the place, from Medicaid, where they want to turn it into block grants, which is just a euphemism for Medicaid cuts. And then they want to take all of those savings and not like reinvest it in some other part of the government, right? Not put it in the Department of Education, not give it to low-income individuals so that they can climb out of poverty. They actually just want to take trillions of dollars from you and give it to them. Madam President, I ask that these final remarks appear in a separate part of the record. Thank you, Madam President. Since taking office just over a month ago, Donald Trump has rapidly obliterated America's standing as the leader of the free world. Decades of hard work, extraordinary sacrifice, and painstaking bipartisan diplomacy to lead our allies and partners against the forces of autocracy and repression have been crushed. And America's reputation as the indispensable nation is in tatters. And it started with the illegal dismantling of the United States Agency for International Development and continued with the unlawful elimination of virtually all foreign assistance and culminated this last weekend, Friday, with the Oval Office meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky last week. Trump has undermined American values and interests at every turn. This is not a doctrine that somehow puts America first. Past presidents of both parties in different words and through different means have aggressively pursued American interests. And I have to say, on the specific question of how USAID operates with the State Department, you hear secretaries of state of both parties saying, hey, it would be great if USAID and the State Department were better aligned. And so I'm the top Democrat on the SFOPS committee, which is the funding committee for foreign aid, and I sat down with the chairman, Lindsey Graham, and I said, I think there's some opportunity to do some bipartisan work here in reforming the foreign aid enterprise. We had a really constructive conversation. That was 2 days before all hell broke loose at USAID. All hell broke loose at USAID. Trump froze all foreign assistance and then moved to illegally shutter USAID, which is responsible for implementing most of our foreign aid. None of it was about achieving efficiency or rooting out waste. It was about Trump trying to wish away whatever parts of the federal government he doesn't like in violation of the law, in violation of the Foreign Assistance Act, in violation of the Constitution, in violation of the Prompt Payments Act, in violation of every appropriations bill that we've ever passed as it relates to USAID since the original Foreign Assistance Act. Like, this is not actually a close call. You can hate USAID. I don't. I think it's great. Or you can think it needs reform. I also think it needs reform. But the way to enact a law is to enact a law. The way to enact a law is not to just break the law and see if a judge will impose parameters on you. Trump literally fired the people whose job it is to identify and combat waste. That is not the kind of thing that you would do if you were interested in combating waste. There was a person at USAID who basically wrote a bunch of factual memorandums to senior staffers saying, this is the consequences of what you're doing. And among other things, it said specifically, hey, you might have a waiver program in place to allow life-saving aid to continue, but you sent everybody home and locked them out of their email. They sent everybody home and locked them out of their email, and then we're to believe that this waiver process is somehow going to push through the billions of dollars for life-saving aid that are needed and expected. And so what is happening? And these big providers, I won't even name them because they're so terrified. Good organizations no political valence. If they have any political inclination, they tend to be Christian organizations doing literally God's work all across the planet. They are laying off people. They are literally closing up tents. People are flying home back to the continental United States or Hawaii or Alaska, wherever they live, and just saying, we're out of here now. So babies are getting HIV/AIDS from their moms now because the PEPFAR funding is frozen. And don't let anybody tell you that PEPFAR is unfrozen. Everything is frozen. Why? Because, and I might be getting this number slightly wrong, but as I recall it, there's about 70 people left. And this is a tens of billions of dollars enterprise. So how the hell are you going to consider a waiver for 5,800 individual programs when you have 70 human beings, not all of them in this particular bureau, to try to process the waivers? And so what I've been told is, hey, if there's anything that's especially important to you, sir, let me know. And I'm thinking, I'm not here to petition the king for mercy. The way this works is everybody operates within the law. We lost the election. Democrats lost the election. We lost the House, we lost the Senate, and we lost the presidency, and we lost it all fair and square. But now it's on Republicans to operate fair and square. And what's happening at USAID, I understand this is not the most compelling issue for people back home in Hawaii or people back home in Alabama or people back home in Illinois or anywhere. It is not like most people's burning desire, but people do understand following the law or not following the law. And what is happening right now is plainly unlawful. They are violating multiple statutes. And the consequences are not some like arcane discussion about legal principles or the rule of law. Millions of people will die. I'm still new enough to the Senate. I'm not that new to the Senate, but I'm still new enough to the Senate where I don't say anything I don't mean to say on the floor. And so I want anybody who's listening to understand, if we don't resolve this, millions of people will die. Millions of people will die because of an illegal decision made by this administration. And so we all have to decide, are we going to stand up for some basic American values? What are those American values? We are the good guys. When people see that USAID logo, they should say, awesome, the Americans are here. When they see that food grown in Georgia, processed in the mid-Atlantic states, grown in Kansas and other places, when they see that food arriving to prevent malnourished kids from going in the wrong direction, they should say, I am so thankful that America exists, not just as a country, but as an idea. We are the good guys. And part of being the good guys is even if you hate something, if it's a law, it's a law. There are a lot of laws on the books that I hate. Global gag rule, first one that comes to mind, but there are probably a dozen more I could come up with. It literally never occurred to me to ask Joe Biden or Barack Obama or Donald Trump or anyone else to violate the statute and see what the judge says. And so we, as the Article I branch, and we as patriots, have to wrap our arms around this problem, get the aid enterprise back up and running for humanitarian reasons, for geopolitical reasons, for legal reasons, for moral reasons, and for reasons related to what we are here to do, which is we are here, if this enterprise needs to be reformed, count me in. But this is a law-making process, not a law-breaking process. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Democratic Whip.
Madam President, I want to thank my colleague from Hawaii. And if he can spare 30 seconds, I'd like to tell him a story. Years ago, I went to India, to the dusty villages, not the big cities, just to see what USAID was doing. I'd heard about it. I wanted to see it. The most graphic example I can remember from that experience was when they showed me a bag of some grain supplement, and on it was written USAID, from the people of the United States of America. And what they were doing with this was making a lunch for the children in the village. I don't think your kids or mine would have touched it. It looked like some odd Rice Krispie ball that was held together with water. And they sat with little tin plates with this Rice Krispie ball on it from the USAID package to eat their lunch. But before they ate their lunch, they paused, and I said, "What's going on?" And the guide said to me, "They're saying a prayer of thanks to this United States of America for giving them food to eat." I thought to myself, for goodness sakes, it's 1% of our federal budget, 1% that we spend in this manner to try to give kids around the world a chance to survive. There are many other things we do, but that basic example of those kids sitting in the dust of that village, eating that Rice Krispie ball, and thanking the United States of America for it, touched my heart and still does to this day. Thanks for what you said. I appreciate it so much. I also want to say a word about what we're going to vote on today, an issue that's going to come before us. I might ask my colleagues if they could answer the following question. How many athletes, NCAA athletes, are there in the United States? I asked Mr. Baker, former governor of Massachusetts, that question. And he said over 500,000. 500,000. And I said, of all those athletes, what percentage are transgender? Oh, fewer than 10. I said, fewer than 10%? No, fewer than 10 total out of 500,000 are transgender. And yet we're going to come to the floor with a proposal from Senator Tuberville to vote on this issue. He's going to attempt to bring to this floor a bill that targets trans youth. This bill would revoke federal funding from schools with athletic programs that allow trans girls to participate on sports teams for women or girls. The bill, which has no enforcement mechanism, could subject women and girls to physical inspection by an adult if someone from an opposing team accused them of being transgender. Think about that for a second. Your daughter, someone in your family, going to play a sport, and someone on the other team challenges them. That's not a little girl, that's a transgender boy. This bill that we're about to vote on gives authority to someone to make a physical inspection of that little girl if someone from the opposing team accuses them of being transgender. Does that sound a little extreme to you? Well, it sure does to me too. This infringes on the privacy of girls and women and is a dangerous use of the powers of government to target children and their families. Put yourself in the shoes of these families for just a moment. Imagine being the parent of a trans kid and telling your child they are not even allowed to play on the same sports team as their friends at school because a politician said they couldn't. Coincidentally, Madam President, I had a hearing on this subject, and in 2023, a teenager named Harley Walker, a 16-year-old transgender girl from the state of Alabama, spoke with an unwavering voice in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee about what it was like to be one of the children who are affected by these anti-transgender laws. Harley Walker, from home state of Alabama, had enacted a law threatening her ability to access the care she needs to be happy and healthy. Harley told the committee, and I quote her words exactly, "I want all of you to look at me, here and now, and hear my words. I am a very happy 16-year-old. I have wonderful friends who accept me for who I am. I'm active in my school's debate team and other extracurriculars. I'm just trying to be a teenager in America," she said. same as any other teen. But I keep having to jump through hoops that other people my age don't have to. I'm here in front of this committee instead of enjoying summer vacation just to try to ensure that my right to exist isn't taken away. It's that personal. It's that important. And we're going to vote here to give someone unspecified the right to physically inspect a girl or a young woman if the other opposing team accuses them of being transgender. My goodness. Is this what we're all about here in the United States Senate? Madam President, on a separate topic, tomorrow night members of Congress and their guests will gather on the floor of the House to hear the President on the status of our nation. This annual address traces its roots back to founding fathers, but I doubt that they would even recognize their beloved country today. With President Trump and Elon Musk acting unrestrained, we are barreling down a dangerous path to a constitutional crisis. In the Judiciary Committee, which you serve on, we had 3 witnesses last week, nominees to serve in important positions in the Department of Justice. The question that was asked of them was very basic. Would you advise a public official in the United States of America to follow a court order? Just that simple, to follow a court order. And they hemmed and they hawed and they said generally so, generally this. The most lucid statement was made by a Republican Senator, John Kennedy of Louisiana, who said the answer is yes. You either follow a court order or you resign your office. It is that basic. But if you listen to those 3 witnesses, there's a serious question whether that would happen. It's a question as to whether or not there is any check or balance on the executive branch if they will not live by the findings of a court. It troubles me. It continues to trouble me. And it's at the heart of our concern about the future of our Constitution. Madam President, I'm going to have a guest at the State of the Union address tomorrow night, Dr. Elizabeth Sokol. She's from Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. I know that hospital well. My daughter was treated there for years. I think it's one of the best on God's green earth. For more than a decade, Dr. Sokol has been a pediatric oncologist at Lurie Children's in Chicago. She treats young children with neuroblastoma, the leading cause of cancer death for children age 1 to 5. Dr. Sokol's work, which includes conducting clinical trials on neuroblastoma brain cancer research, is funded by the National Institutes of Health. The NIH is quite simply the premier medical research agency in the world. It provides over $38 billion in research funding to all 50 states, including yours and mine, studying everything from pediatric cancer to dementia, Alzheimer's, ALS, diabetes care, and heart disease. Breakthrough research supported by the NIH has made a difference. You know all those ads you see on television about those drugs? You can hardly pronounce their names or remember them. People skipping through a field of flowers, feeling better because they take a certain drug. 99% of all the new drugs in the United States, all of them, 99%, started in research at the National Institutes of Health. If they're good and they're important, you can credit taxpayers for creating an agency that does the research. That breakthrough research has made a difference in the lives of thousands of people. Yet this is one of the agencies, the National Institutes of Health, that President Trump is dismantling through a series of abrupt, illegal, devastating funding cuts, gag orders, and mass firings. As a result of President Trump's actions, Dr. Sokol's work on neuroblastoma in kids, brain cancer in kids, and the lives of the kids who depend on it is in serious danger. Rather than empty rhetoric, Dr. Sokol actually does the work to make America great, offering families hope. You don't think that these families think it's great if she can find something to cure their child? Donald Trump and Elon Musk are trying to stop her. That sounds like a rash political statement, but it's true. At the same time, Dr. Sokol's hospital, Lurie's Children, is staring down massive cuts to Medicaid for life-saving treatment of critically ill children. Medicaid is the lifeline for Children's Hospital. If we go through with the planned budget we hear from the House, the cutbacks of 14.5% in Medicaid funding will dramatically hit American hospitals. Rural hospitals will close, children's hospitals will close, programs will be shut down. Medicaid is their lifeline. It covers nearly half the kids in this country. If you slash Medicaid funding for Lurie Children's in Chicago, Cincinnati Children's in Ohio, Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, you are harming life-saving treatment for kids with cancer and other serious conditions. For as long as I can stand and speak, I'll be standing and speaking in support of NIH funding and the work of people like Dr. Sokol. She's my guest tomorrow night because I want my colleagues, when we sit down together for a light dinner before the address, to meet this NIH researcher and hear from her firsthand what the cuts of Elon Musk and Donald Trump are doing to children's research in America. Surely we are better than that. The last point I want to make is this, Madam President. Today is a special day in the state of Illinois, and no other state that I know of today. It is Kazimierz Pulaski Day. Kazimierz Pulaski was a Polish patriot who decided to help America in the Revolutionary War. He came over, and his military experience led him to create the U.S. Cavalry. He was in a battle of Savannah and severely wounded and died. He served our country as a patriot, even though he was a Polish person, not an American. Well, we take that pretty seriously in Chicago, where there are more people of Polish ancestry than any other place on earth except for Warsaw, Poland. We're pretty proud of that fact. And today we were proud of the fact that the president of Poland came to Chicago. President Duda and his wife were given a warm welcome at the Polish National Museum. And I recalled the time, it really wasn't that long ago, when finally the Iron Curtain came down. And we had a question to ask. How are we going to protect the nations that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact, or nations that used to be Soviet republics? What is going to protect them if they want to aspire to democracy and move toward the West? We came up with the obvious answer. There was only one alliance that could protect them, the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Because in the 80 years now that it's been in existence, it's done its job of avoiding World War III and strengthening the countries in the alliance, because we stand arm in arm next to one another. As I said today, it was a Pulaski moment. The United States and Poland standing together again for the future of both of their nations. I believe in NATO, and I don't know what it will do without it, but now we have to consider that. This new president, just a few weeks into his presidency, is threatening the very future and existence of NATO. If we walk away from it, if the United States disengages from NATO, the question is whether or not Europe can stand on its own feet. I think they will eventually. But in the meantime, countries like Poland, the Baltic nations, and many others are vulnerable to Putin's aggression. What he did in Ukraine 3 years ago, and even before that, he will do again. And smaller nations don't have a prayer in fighting him. I am saddened, shocked, stunned at what happened in the Oval Office last week with President Zelensky. To have that display in live television breaks my heart. To think that this situation is such that we would humiliate our ally in Ukraine and at the same time talk about the greatness of Vladimir Putin, just I find disgusting. People are no students of history if they buy into that thinking. For the longest time, we've stood with the people of Ukraine. Do you know what the briefing was when they invaded Ukraine? They called the senators down, and the intelligence agency says, let me tell you what's going to happen when finally Putin pulls the trigger and invades Ukraine. Those Ukrainians will last between 3 days and 2 weeks. That was it, 2 weeks if they're good. And then it'll be a guerrilla war. Well, they were certainly wrong. Here we are 3 years later, and the Ukrainians are still fighting. How many Ukrainians have died so far? We can't come up with an accurate figure, but we know 46,000 have died. 46,000 have died fighting Putin, who invaded their country. And this president calls the head of the Ukrainian country, Zelensky, a dictator, and says that he actually invaded his own country. What in the world is he talking about? These people have been fighting to the death. Millions have been displaced, and they have been standing up for the values that we cherish in this country. To walk away from them and to subject their leader to what we saw last Friday in the Oval Office is disgusting, humiliating, below the dignity of the United States. I stand behind Ukraine. Maybe that's why I'm wearing this tie today. I stand behind Ukraine because I believe those people are fighting for the very values that we treasure. and they stood by the United States, and they said thank you many, many times to me and to others. We need to stand behind NATO and Ukraine and stand for the values that are important. Hitching our star to Vladimir Putin is a fool's errand. It is a disaster waiting to happen. I hope to goodness we don't reach that point. And I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Madam President.
The senator from Wisconsin.
Madam President, I rise today in strong opposition.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Oh, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today in strong opposition to any attempt by the federal government to meddle in decisions about who can and cannot participate in school sports. Simply put, it's not for the federal governments, it's not their place to tell state and local sports leagues across this country how to do their jobs. This is a decision for local communities where players and parents can participate in that discussion at the local level. This is a decision for sports leagues to thoughtfully craft policy that actually takes seriously what is best for all players, not blanket mandates that will undoubtedly have unintended consequences for the safety of all students. I, for one, trust our states, our leagues, our localities to make these decisions without interference from Congress or the President. For years, we have seen them do it thoughtfully and carefully. They have done what is best for the children in consultation with parents, teachers, coaches, and community members. This is exactly how this type of policy should be created. But Republicans are now saying that they actually know better than these local sports leagues. The president is saying that he knows better than parents what is good for their children. President Donald Trump and my Republican colleagues have inserted themselves into this discussion, tying the hands of leagues who are actually focused on the best interests of our children. And as far as I can tell, it's just to score political points and stir the pot of the culture wars. I'll close with this. Too often in this debate, it gets lost that we're talking about real people. It's clear that my Republican colleagues, when they casually dehumanize trans Americans in their attack ads, forget or simply do not care that they are talking about real people, often youth, often children, who already do not feel welcome in their communities. This legislation tries to send the message that certain kids are not welcome in Little League or on the basketball court, and really that they are not welcome in school at all beside their peers. What a heartbreaking message to tell a child. No American, especially those who are already vulnerable, should be demonized and picked on so that politicians can win elections, period, full stop. And at the end of the day, while Republicans are focused on playing politics with children's sports leagues, I'm focused on the issue that I hear about from my constituents every day. I am focused on lowering household costs and taking on the big corporations that are price gouging families at the grocery store and at the pharmacy. And I'm focused on growing our Made in America economy and making sure that everyone has a fair chance to get a good paying job. I am focused on ensuring that people can access high quality health care and protecting Medicaid. I'm focused on the people of Wisconsin and their needs, not stepping on their right to decide what is best in their own local communities. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. You know, I got my start in politics as a mom in tennis shoes fighting to protect a preschool program, and I still wear that label proudly. I am a former preschool teacher. I'm also a former community college educator, and I am also a former school board member. So I don't mess around when it comes to making sure every single one of our students in every corner of our country has access to quality public education, one that leaves them prepared for the future and opens the doors of opportunity wide. It's not a responsibility I take lightly. It never will be. Our kids are the future of this country, and the Department of Education is really at the heart of how we make sure they are set up for success. But Donald Trump and Elon Musk want to rip the heart out of public education in America and abolish the Department of Education. Well, not if I can help it, and that's why I believe we need a leader at the Department of Education who actually believes in the mission of the Department of Education. We need a Secretary of Education with a really deep understanding of how to use this crucial position to strengthen educational opportunities and outcomes for every student in this country. We need a Secretary of Education who will put students first, not billionaires, who will stand up for our kids, every single one of them, even if it means standing up to Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And Madam President, on each of these accounts, Linda McMahon fails to make the grade. I've had concerns from the outset about whether Ms. McMahon has the experience we should expect from an education secretary. And I'm sorry to say my concerns have not been alleviated. Far from it. I asked her in our confirmation hearing about the Every Student Succeeds Act. That is the law I negotiated with Republicans to finally fix the No Child Left Behind and to provide more flexibility to our states and schools while ensuring accountability for our tax dollars. She couldn't name a single requirement of that law, not one. How is she supposed to enforce our education laws when she didn't even bother to study up before her Senate confirmation hearing? On fighting for public schools, it is painfully clear that McMahon's plan for our students and schools is in lockstep with Trump's pro-billionaire agenda. They're going to let public schools get robbed blind as the richest people in the world suck money out of our schools and communities that need it the most. They're going to cut off funding that directly supports our students and teachers and send it straight to the pockets of unaccountable private and for-profit K-12 schools. And on standing up for our students, standing up to President Trump, Melinda McMahon got it backwards. When I asked her at the hearing about making sure schools get the money that we, Congress, passes, even if Trump and Musk try to block it, and making sure that our students' data is protected as DOJ tries to muck around with no oversight or accountability, she made it very clear she would not stand in their way. But it gets worse, because when it comes to Trump's mission of destroying the Department of Education, she's all too ready to grab a hatchet and get to work. The irony is that while Trump and Musk talk about eliminating the Department of Education, they're trying to involve the federal government even deeper into the schools than ever before. They talk about how schools and parents know best, and then they threaten schools if they don't do what they say. Apparently, Ms. McMahon thinks, why should we have a Department of Education if Trump and Elon Musk can actually just tell schools what they can do and what they can teach? Well, let's be clear what it will mean if Trump, Musk, and McMahon have their way and try to turn the Department of Education into something that kids read about in our history books. There are 26 million K-12 students from low-income neighborhoods who could see their schools lose federal funding, lay off teachers, or even close. There are 9.8 million students at our rural schools that count